Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now before I begin, tell me where you are watching from. I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. It happened on one of those ordinary afternoons when everything feels still. The sky was pale, the kind that holds no promises, and I had only stopped by the store to pick up a few things: milk, bread, and maybe some fruit for the week. I wasn't expecting to see anyone I knew, especially not someone from my past. But as I reached for a loaf of bread, I heard a voice behind me, warm yet hesitant, say my name. When I turned, I froze. It was Michael, my ex's best friend from years ago. He looked different, older of course, but the familiar kindness in his eyes hadn't changed. It took me a second to find my voice, and when I finally did, all I could manage was a surprised, "Michael? Oh my goodness, it's been years." He smiled, a little awkwardly, as though unsure how welcome he was. "Yeah, a long time. I didn't expect to run into you here." He looked down at the cart in my hands and chuckled softly. "Still buying the same brand of bread, I see." That small detail caught me off guard. It was strange how he remembered something so simple from those years when we were all closer, when he'd visit with my ex for dinner, and we'd all sit around the table laughing about nothing important. Those memories, though buried, rose gently in my chest, carrying with them a mix of nostalgia and quiet ache. We stood there in the aisle, surrounded by the soft hum of background music and the steady squeak of shopping carts rolling by. It felt oddly private, like the rest of the store faded into silence. I noticed lines on his face that hadn't been there before, signs of time and life's weight, but there was something steady and reassuring about him. "I heard about the divorce," he said after a pause, his voice careful. I wanted to reach out, but I didn't know if it was my place. I took a slow breath, feeling the heaviness of that time all over again. "It was hard," I admitted, "but I'm okay now. Life moves on, doesn't it?" He nodded, though I could see something thoughtful in his eyes, as if he wanted to say more, but was choosing his words carefully. "I always thought you deserved better," he finally said softly. His tone wasn't sharp or bitter, just honest, like something he had carried quietly for years. That simple sentence struck something deep within me. I didn't know what to say. The words felt too big for the narrow aisle we were standing in. All I could do was look at him, really look, and see the sincerity written across his face. We talked a little more about how life had unfolded, where we both ended up, how quickly time seemed to pass. There was no awkwardness, no resentment, just an unspoken understanding between two people who had witnessed the same past from different corners. Before I knew it, we were standing outside, the grocery bags resting by our feet as a cool breeze brushed through. He looked at me for a long moment and said quietly, "I always wanted to tell you something back then, but it never felt right. Maybe someday I'll find the courage." I smiled, though my heart felt heavy with curiosity and something else, something gentler, like an old door opening just a little after years of silence. "Maybe someday you should," I replied. As I drove home that afternoon, his words replayed in my mind again and again. They weren't loud, but they lingered, the kind of words that stay with you long after the moment passes. And though I didn't know what he had meant exactly, something inside me told me that meeting him again wasn't just coincidence. It was the beginning of something I hadn't expected, a quiet stirring in a life I thought had already settled. I didn't see Michael again for a few days after that, but the memory of our conversation followed me around like a soft echo. I'd find myself thinking about the way he looked at me, steady, sincere, and almost protective. It wasn't romantic in the way young people imagine it. It was something quieter, something that came from understanding what life does to people. That following Saturday, I stopped by the same store again. It was partly habit and partly hope, though I wouldn't have admitted that to myself. I lingered a bit longer than usual in the same aisle, pretending to compare prices while secretly listening for that familiar voice. But instead of Michael, I just heard the rhythm of ordinary life, the beep of the register, the murmur of other shoppers, and the faint hum of a song I couldn't quite name. I paid for my groceries and walked toward the parking lot, where the sun was beginning to dip behind the buildings. The air was warm but gentle, touched with the faint smell of rain from earlier that morning. As I placed the bags in my car, I heard someone call out behind me, "You're getting predictable." I turned, and there he was, Michael again, leaning against his car with a smile that made him look both familiar and new at once. "Do you come here every Saturday now?" he teased. I laughed softly, shaking my head. "You caught me. Maybe it's just habit." He walked closer, his hands in his pockets, and for a brief moment, it felt like time folded in on itself. There was an ease between us that shouldn't have been there, not after years apart, not after all the shared history through someone who was no longer part of my life. We talked for a while beside our cars. He told me he had recently moved back into town after his mother passed away. "I thought being closer to familiar places might help," he said, his tone quiet. "I'm sorry," I replied. "She was a kind woman. I remember her laugh." He smiled faintly. "She liked you, you know. Said you had the kind of kindness that doesn't fade." That sentence settled in my chest like a warm ember. There was no rush to fill the silence that followed. We both just stood there, watching the streaks of light fade into the evening. It was strange how comforting it felt to be near someone who carried pieces of my past but didn't remind me of pain. Before leaving, he asked, "Would it be all right if I called you sometime? Maybe we could have coffee just to catch up properly." Something inside me hesitated, though not from fear. It was the kind of hesitation that comes when you sense your life might be about to shift, even slightly. "That would be nice," I said finally with a small smile. When I got home, I placed the groceries on the counter and leaned against the sink, feeling that strange mix of peace and uncertainty. It had been years since someone had looked at me not as someone's former wife, not as a woman rebuilding, but simply as myself. The next morning, I found a text waiting. "Coffee's better when shared. Tomorrow? 10 a.m.? M." And without overthinking it, I typed back, "See you then." I didn't realize it at the time, but that small exchange would open a door I hadn't known was still locked, a door leading not just to someone from my past, but to a truth about myself I had long forgotten. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floor. I stood by the window, holding my coffee, watching the sunlight spill across the street. I told myself it was just coffee with an old acquaintance, nothing more, but deep down, I knew it felt like more than that. It felt like stepping into a memory that hadn't quite finished writing itself. When I arrived at the cafe, Michael was already there, sitting by the window. He stood up as soon as he saw me, that same thoughtful smile on his face. "You're early," he said, pulling out the chair across from him. "So are you," I replied. He laughed lightly. "Guess neither of us likes to keep people waiting." The cafe was warm and smelled of roasted coffee beans and fresh pastries. Outside, people hurried along the sidewalks, wrapped in coats and their own little worlds, but inside it felt still, like time had slowed for the both of us. We talked about simple things at first. Work, family, the kind of small updates you give someone who once knew you well, but now only knows your shadow. But soon the conversation deepened in that quiet, natural way that happens when two people stop pretending. He told me about the years after my divorce, how he'd wanted to reach out but didn't want to seem intrusive. "I saw what you went through," he said softly. "You were always the steady one, holding things together when no one else could see the cracks." I looked down at my cup, tracing the rim with my finger. I didn't feel steady, I admitted. I just didn't want to fall apart where anyone could see. He nodded, his expression gentle. You didn't deserve to carry all that alone. Those words touched something deep inside me, something that had been quiet for too long. I realized no one had said that to me before, not in all the years since. People had offered sympathy or polite encouragement, but never acknowledgement of what it truly meant to endure. I told him about the nights when I'd sit awake, wondering if I had made the right choices, if walking away had been strength or just exhaustion. He listened, not interrupting, not offering empty comfort, just listening, the way few people really do anymore. When the conversation paused, he said something that caught me off guard. You know, he began, I used to tell him he didn't deserve you. I looked up, startled. You said that? He gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. More than once, but it wasn't my place to interfere. You were both my friends, and I thought things would work out eventually. But when they didn't, I just hoped you'd find peace. It was a strange feeling, gratitude mixed with a bittersweet ache. I wanted to say something, but my throat felt tight, so I just nodded. After a while, the conversation drifted to lighter things again, and by the time we finished our coffee, I realized 2 hours had passed without me noticing. As we stepped outside, the air was cool and bright, carrying the faint scent of rain on pavement. He looked at me for a moment before saying, You seem different now. Stronger, but softer too. I smiled faintly. Life has a way of reshaping us. He nodded slowly. Sometimes it breaks us to rebuild what was missing. There was something in the way he said it, quiet, deliberate, almost like he was speaking from his own pain. I wanted to ask what he meant, but he quickly changed the subject, mentioning a bookstore nearby that he loved. As I watched him walk beside me, hands in his jacket pockets, a thought crossed my mind, unexpected but undeniable. Maybe, just maybe, some people reappear in your life not to remind you of what was lost, but to help you see what still remains. And in that moment I realized, whatever this was, it wasn't just coincidence. It was something quietly unfolding piece by piece, like the soft return of warmth after a long winter. That coffee meeting turned into another, and then another. Each time we met, the conversations went a little deeper, a little more honest. There was never any rush, no pressure, just a natural rhythm, like two people rediscovering the language of understanding. I found myself looking forward to our talks, not for excitement or nostalgia, but for the calm that came with them. Michael had a way of making silence feel comfortable, of filling the air not with noise, but with presence. One evening, a few weeks later, he called and asked if I'd like to join him for a walk. The sky had just turned amber, the last stretch of daylight clinging to the rooftops. I said yes, and soon we were strolling through the park near the lake, where the air smelled faintly of pine and the water mirrored the fading sun. For a while, we just walked side by side, our steps matching naturally. The path was nearly empty, only a few joggers passing by, their footsteps fading behind us. It felt peaceful, almost like the world had paused to let us catch up. At one point, Michael stopped near a bench overlooking the water. Do you ever think about how much changes when you're not paying attention? He asked quietly. I looked at the still lake and nodded. All the time. You wake up one morning, and suddenly the people you thought would be there forever are just gone. Or they've changed into someone you don't recognize anymore. He was silent for a moment before replying. That's how I felt after everything ended between you two. It felt wrong to lose both of you, even though I knew it wasn't my place to say anything. His honesty caught me off guard. You didn't have to choose sides, I said softly. He turned toward me, his expression thoughtful. Maybe not, but I did. I chose silence, and I've regretted it more than I expected. The breeze picked up slightly, carrying the sound of distant laughter from somewhere across the park. I could see the reflection of the fading light in his eyes, steady, searching, a little tired. Michael, I said after a pause, You couldn't have changed what happened. Some things are just meant to end. He nodded slowly. Maybe. But sometimes I wonder if endings are just pauses waiting for the right moment to continue in a different way. His words lingered between us, gentle but heavy with meaning. I didn't answer. Instead, I sat on the bench, and he joined me. For a long time, we didn't speak. The world moved quietly around us, the soft ripple of water, the rustle of trees, the distant hum of a car passing by. When he finally spoke again, his voice was steady but low. The thing I wanted to tell you back then, it wasn't about him. It was about you. I respected you too much to say it when everything was falling apart. I turned to him, my heart unexpectedly tight. Say it now, I whispered, though my voice barely carried. He met my eyes, and there was no hesitation left in him. You changed the way I saw people, he said simply. You taught me that kindness isn't weakness, that love isn't about holding on, but about letting someone be themselves. I never forgot that. And when I saw you again, I realized some lessons don't fade. They just wait for the right moment to remind us who we used to be. The words struck deep, not because they were grand, but because they were real. For years I had carried a quiet fear that everything I'd done, all the endurance and forgiveness, had gone unnoticed. And yet here was someone who had seen it all, remembered it, and carried it with him. We sat there until the sky turned dark and the streetlights flickered on. Neither of us needed to say more. It wasn't about love or rekindled emotions. It was about two people finding peace in the understanding that some connections survive time, distance, and even silence. When we finally stood to leave, Michael smiled and said, "I'm glad I found you that day at the store." I smiled back. "Maybe you didn't find me," I said softly. "Maybe we both just ended up where we were supposed to be." As I drove home under the quiet glow of the streetlights, I realized something I hadn't before. Life doesn't always give us the closure we expect, but sometimes it gives us something better, a moment that reminds us we were never forgotten. And that night, for the first time in a long while, my heart felt still, understood, and gently whole again.